Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Thursday, April 3rd, 2025. I'm John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Washington commentary columnist Matthew Continetti. Hi, Matt.
Hi, John.
And joining us today, Honcho at the Bahnsen Group, economic commentator, author of several very enlightening books, and a commentary contributor, David Bahnsen. Hi, David.
Hello, John.
Welcome to Liberation, David. And I just want to set out a quick ground rule before we start talking about Liberation Day and the tariffs. We are recording this at about 8:10 in the morning, Thursday morning. So we do not have. People are going to be listening to this. The market will be gyrating in the United States during Thursday. And so I don't want to go into sort of like what the instantaneous effects of this momentous event in the laying on of the tariffs is going to be, because people will be experiencing it in real time and we could get it wrong. So I think we need to pull back to a higher elevation and talk about the larger meaning of what has been imposed here and what the longer term consequences might or might not be, not whether or not, things are going to be catastrophic today or tomorrow. And then thankfully we'll go into the weekend and trading will stop for a couple of days. And then maybe, sweet reason will prevail by Monday morning. So having said that, David, you educated in economics, as an economist, as somebody who advises people on how to invest money and that sort of thing. How momentous a shift in everything that you yourself were taught, learned, have preached, have invested on as a strategy, and have viewed as a way of understanding the world when you were talking about markets and money. How momentous a shift is this from what you would consider to be not conventional wisdom, but let's say like the laws of economic gravity, or the second law of thermodynamics, or something like that the United States simply unilaterally imposes tariffs across the planet at a minimum of 10%, with the exception of Canada and Mexico, which have been exempted for their own tariff reasons.
I think what has switched is not the laws of thermodynamics. The expectations that we would have economically about policies like this remain. The big paradigm shift is that this is coming from the right. And so there's a constitutional, legal, political side to that. And then there is the economic side. That the Republicans are all tolerating the imperialism of a president. The language that was not said at the Rose Garden yesterday that we saw subsequently is that full modification authority lies with the president. We are just handing an individual full discretion over tax authority, which is specifically reserved for Congress in the Constitution. And we are pretending, and all okay with pretending. I mean, I guess about 80% of Republicans are okay with pretending that this is a national security emergency. Nike shoes and washing machine handles, the discretion being taken here to...
Bananas, David. Bananas.
It's bananas.
Bananas are a huge national security problem.
Oh, I thought you were saying it's bananas.
No, I am actually literally referring to the banana, which we have almost no domestic market. We don't produce bananas in the United States. Coffee and bananas are two very good examples.
Starbucks not going to be happy today.
Yeah.
But the general economic pretense that is being presented to us is that there is going to be some short-term pain in exchange for a long-term gain. The short-term pain is significantly different than what some of the president's advisors understand it to be. And the long-term gain is both totally untrue, most certainly immeasurable, and for very clear and easy reasons that I'll lay out in 5 seconds, absolutely impossible to price into this. The idea that people will say these tariffs are imposing a large cost to us as American importers and manufacturers, so we are going to now build the capacity to do it here in the States. The president's gone in 3 years. The fact of the matter is that most of these things would take far more than 3 years to build and many, many, many billions of dollars. And if they could flick a switch and do it now and just take off the political considerations that keep them from doing that, that all that would mean is that the high costs were then put through the system by nature of them becoming domestically created. It isn't like the only cost here is the tariffs. If you were to actually onshore the production of Nike shoes, it will be more expensive than it is in Vietnam. Now, the administration, from a protectionist standpoint, wants to say that that's a net trade-off that we like. The problem with that is that it will end up along the way undermining all of the things he wants to do as the services sector, which is substantially larger than the jobs he's trying to bring back on shore, gets pummeled. And you go into a recession,
Can
so
we
you
talk
get a
about the
spiral.
service sector? Can we talk about the service sector? Because the United States is a net exporter of services. That is our great strength in our economy, right? That is our, okay. So as I understand it, services were eliminated as a calculation in how they decided to levy these tariffs. We are only looking at
goods,
manufacturing and goods, and therefore we were evaluating this as though we did not have a net strength and a comparative advantage over the entire rest of the planet in an enormous sector, maybe the largest single sector if you aggregate it, in an enormous sector of the planet's economy. So it is a false picture of the American economy and its relation to the rest of the world that Trump was operating from, and that he made that big, beautiful chart that he was, carrying around on a poster board yesterday in the Rose Garden.
But that big, beautiful chart we now know, and I'm just utterly shocked that Stephen Myron at Council of Economic Advisors let this deliverable come out with his name on it. It isn't calculating what the tariff policies are of these other countries. It's all over social media now. It took a few kind of amateur people about 5 seconds to figure out that all they did is basically take the trade deficits divided by the imports. And so that's why you're getting countries that don't really have tariffs with us or have very small tariffs, and they're treating their non-trade barriers as if they're this very high number, because all they're targeting is the actual trade deficit. And as you point out, they're not including services. So of course, most of these countries have a large trade deficit, and that is not tariff oriented. So it's the most pedestrian thing you could imagine, and outside the real core philosophy of what the president says. Reciprocity and fairness is not really what it's targeting, and that's why you end up with some countries that are being hit much less, that have higher tariffs on us than other countries that have lower tariffs. The whole thing, even apart from my philosophical disagreement and me being more of a Milton Friedman, Thomas Sowell guy on this stuff, just from a kind of execution standpoint, they are underperforming my expectations. And my expectations were for 6th grade level delivery.
Okay, so I'm laughing. I'm really not laughing. I mean, I'm not an economist, but and I'm not going to compare what happened yesterday to 9/11, but I do have this feeling in the pit of my stomach like we have crossed a Rubicon here, and that people are still in the denial period in which they're saying, well, this could all go away next week somehow. That he did it. He does seem to have the unilateral power to undo it, but now that it has been done, now that his desideratum has been achieved, that we have crossed into a new economic world in the 21st century solely as the result of one person's fixed obsession. That is terrifying to me. But I also want to spend a moment, and Matt, maybe you can help reflect on this. I think a lot of us who were, let's say, we're dovish on immigration over the last 20 years, right? So we were dovish, and people would say to us, you know what, you guys don't understand this. You're all emotional about, Jews coming in the early 20th century and how wonderful immigration is and all of that, but you don't understand the cost of this illegal labor coming over, how it has affected the lowest quintile of earners in the United States, and that one of the benefits of tightening immigration is that, yes, costs are going to go up for people who have to do things like, pick fruit or do the jobs that Americans won't do in order to get them to do it, but that is a necessary trade-off, and that in the end, over time, we will have a world in which incomes and the outcomes are properly rebalanced. The working class will get a shot. They will have a better income, and America will be better off after this period of adjustment. And I never really had an answer to that, except that it's not bad that vegetables are cheap or that fruit is cheap. Like the idea that that's bad if 90% of the country has access to less expensive food, and that you're going to simply change that willy-nilly for a larger purpose is something you shouldn't be so cavalier about. I now notice that many of the people that I had this argument with over time are absolutely horrified by these tariffs, like David Frum, for example. But isn't it the same argument? Aren't you basically saying we need to explode the not that, because there's illegality involved in immigration. I'm not going there, but I mean economically, aren't you saying pain for gain later that is fairer and more equitable for the entire country? And if you're going to believe that, then maybe you should be for these tariffs. I don't know.
Well,
can't just say I don't like them because Trump put them on.
No, well, that's right. But the question here is who suffers? And we are being told that global elites will suffer and the working class will benefit. This issue you bring up about cost, like why are cheap vegetables such a bad thing? It's a bigger point than you realize, John, because first of all, they try to infantilize the issue and make it silly. They don't talk about vegetables and nutritious food that all of us have to eat. They talk about like toasters and video games to try to downplay that basically we ruined the middle class in our country just so rich people could get a Game Boy for their teenage kids or something. They try to make it very silly. But the bigger issue to me is that these lower prices are primarily the things the working class people benefit from. And that we talk as if working class people don't buy things. So there's this total economic equivocation as if consumers and producers are two different people instead of different hats that the same person wears. I think, John, that your point on the immigration side and how people are going to be aligned on this issue is very interesting. But ultimately, President Trump was elected because a lot of people believe that prices went up under President Biden and that there was this ongoing frustration of not being heard or listened to. And I forget the politics of it. He can't run again, but just from a midterm standpoint and just where the overall party is left and why I think right-wing populism flips to left-wing populism very quickly out of this, is that they're just simply going to realize their standard of living is not going to go higher. Their prices go higher. Their real wages do not go higher. In what world does that benefit the sort of steel town worker that we're told is going to be the beneficiary of these policies? But if I can very quickly, he did say something yesterday. You're saying that a lot of people with wishful thinking still hope this can just sort of reverse. But the pit in your stomach is saying we're headed to this new economic paradigm, and it's very quite dangerous, Smoot-Hawley-ish, economically isolationist, and all of these things. Nobody can say that you're wrong because nobody knows. That uncertainty, that unpredictability is one of the great problems. The market is, as we're talking right now, about to open down 1,200 points today, and much worse with the NASDAQ, not merely because of the announcement, not merely because the tariff rates yesterday were on the worst end of what was expected. It's the worst of all worlds because it was a bad tariff announcement and still uncertain, and still with all kinds of carve-outs and waivers and presidential discretion. So you're getting bad news and uncertainty at once. And yet he said yesterday in his presser, Johnson & Johnson has announced $55 billion of investment in American, back on shore. And so because my firm owns over $100 million of Johnson & Johnson, I've owned it and covered the stock for almost 25 years, it immediately hit me. It's a nonsense thing he said. Johnson & Johnson has invested over $40 billion over the last 40 years. And they announced that it would be $55 billion over the next 40 years. So they're in.
So it's consistent. So it's essentially a continuation of the pre-April 2nd announcement of the thrilling
100%.
wonders.
100%. It was a non-announcement. The only thing that was an announcement is that they were saying it out loud for the purpose of it being a headline that President Trump could repeat. I took from that yesterday what I still believe is the eventual off-ramp. He just wants to announce something that sounds like he won. That's where I think.
So does that mean, so Abe, and by the way, I think there's a way of expanding this out. Abe has been writing brilliantly in his newsletter. Please go subscribe to Abe's newsletter. You can go to commentary.org. Right there at the top of our page, his newsletter, put in your email address and subscribe. You'll get Abe's daily essay around 4 p.m. Abe made the point that Zelensky was right that the other day that after the humiliation in the Oval Office, that Trump made all these assumptions about Putin. Putin is basically sticking it in Trump's craw. He humiliated Zelensky, attacked Zelensky. Zelensky came to the table, agreed to things in order to pacify and mollify Trump, and there is going to be no deal. Not because Trump doesn't want a deal. Zelensky doesn't want a deal, but was willing to have the deal shoved down his throat because the alternative was worse. But because Putin doesn't want a deal. You can't make somebody make a deal that they don't want to make a deal. And we have now Trump announcing to the entire world that he is rebalancing the world economy, and the world doesn't have to take it sitting down. Doesn't have to take it lying down. Obviously, no individual player on the planet has the power of the United States to launch a trade war or whatever, but it's not like people don't have agency to respond. The uncertainty is not just what Trump is going to do at any given moment, right? Say, I want to deal with Iran, and then I'm going to bomb Iran, and then I'm not going to bomb Iran, and then I'm going to bomb Iran. It's that the uncertainty extends outward from the United States to 200 other countries that now have to grapple with how they're going to deal with a reality in which their lives have just gotten a lot more expensive.
Well, so, did you see that? So the U.S. warned other countries as well yesterday, saying, look, if you retaliate, we're going to escalate. So do take it. Take it lying down.
How can we escalate against China, by the way? We now have a 54, depending on the way you calculate it, we either have a 34 or 54% tariff on China. What are we going to do, raise it to 84%?
Right.
I mean, not that I don't want to be, I like being in kind of like daggers drawn with China. Don't get me wrong. I mean, there's a limit to how much retaliation we can do after this. I mean, I guess with Europe, we could get harsher, right?
Also, I think, John, just to also broaden it just for a second, it's a kind of a side note, but this occurred to me yesterday in conjunction with what I had written about Trump's sort of denial about the nature of Russia and Putin, the denial of economic common sense here. I think all this goes to show that, among other things, he really does believe that he won in 2020. by the way. Like it really does show how impervious to evidence he is and to reason. But that's a sort of side point.
Right. Okay. By the way, I should mention that Matt had massive internet failure, and so that's why, if you're watching on YouTube, you see Matt has disappeared from our screens, and if you're listening to us, you haven't heard Matt's voice. So we, of course, we regret the loss of his wisdom on this day. David, let's talk about uncertainty, because when people want a policy, an economic policy, and you raise uncertainty as an objection to the economic policy, they all go, that's vibes. What are you talking about? Uncertainty, schmuncertainty. Like, don't give me this. There's no way to calculate it. Things change. That's the whole point about actions, that as actions change the baseline, something else happens, you become something else. That's not the way to calculate anything, blah, blah, blah. This is just a conservative way of making sure that liberal policies are blocked by saying that they're going to have this effect. And we talked about uncertainty in 2021 and 2022, and who was right and who was wrong. We were right, they were wrong. Uncertainty is a real thing. You establish policies and then you go back on them. You establish regulatory regimes and then you change all the rules in them. And you make the people who have to live under those conditions say, I just got to freeze in place and do what I'm doing and remain entirely status quo because God knows what's coming down the road. And Trump brings uncertainty to a new existential level, as the Ukraine-Russia example would seem to suggest. Yeah, maybe next week he'll be schooled and that's the off, David, you offer the off-ramp. But who's not to say that he'll get back on the on-ramp in September when Peter Navarro comes to him with another cockamamie idea that sounds like something he believed in high school?
The part that is being missed here is the economic growth. So if we're saying that they can undo policies that would raise prices, so therefore mitigate inflationary risk, that's part of the equation. And it is probably easier to contain the negative price impact than it is the negative growth impact. Because contrary to the absurdity of people saying that uncertainty is not a real problem, capital investment does get hindered by uncertainty. And capital investment drives productivity, and productivity drives economic growth. This is a tautology. I'm not saying anything philosophical. I'm not saying anything complicated, and I'm certainly not saying anything partisan. If people believe that you get the same economic growth with declines in productivity, or you get the same productivity with declines in capital investment, then I want to do a business deal with that person. It's the stupidest thing a human being could utter. Right now, what I don't agree with is the Keynesian idea of animal spirits, that there is this self-fulfilling prophecy of the consumer feeling good and they might not go to the mall. That is something I'm very willing to mock, and I've mocked it for most of my adult life, and I've been right my entire adult life. Our consumers don't stop spending unless they lose credit. And I have no problem with saying that some consumers will say they don't feel good right now, they have bad sentiment or bad confidence as they still go out to the bar on Friday night with their friends. But we're talking about the production side, which those of us on the Reaganite Republican right as supply-siders have been saying forever is the impetus to economic growth, to a higher standard of living in our society. And right now, it will become a systemic issue, even if it's marginal, but all economics is marginal. I'm not suggesting a recessionary drop overnight. I'm suggesting a marginal drop. But when you have an economy with our metrics, a marginal move is the difference between expansion and contraction. And there will absolutely be a decline in capital investment as a result of this uncertainty. And that is the best case scenario. Okay, that's on the basis of assuming he really does reel things back and you find an off-ramp and all that. Even then, you have entrenched a certain degree of decline in activity that then has a lag effect, because economic investment like this, capital goods investment, is not a light switch. A great example of this, John, is the energy sector. When they decide they want to get more wells activated and then they stop because steel prices are up 30%, the ability to go back in and change that can be a year, 2 years. These are long-term investments. And if anybody didn't read the Dallas Fed survey last week, I put a bunch of highlights at dividendcafe.com last Friday. Do you tell me one of these oil and gas executives that the Fed is surveying that didn't vote for Trump? Okay, these are not left-wing hacks. This is in the Dallas region is entirely Texas, Oklahoma, Permian Basin type people. Every single one of them saying, we are holding back on investment, holding back on shovels in the ground, holding back on activating new wells. And there's always some geopolitical uncertainty involved in this, but almost across the board, the issues were impact of prices in copper, steel, et cetera, industrial production considerations. I'm sorry, but that is clearly going to have an impact on economic growth.
Well, I'm glad to report that Matt has solved his internet problems. He has returned and has not been able to hear the conversation that we've had thus far. So let's move into some practical political questions. David, you mentioned we can't help ourselves because here we are. We're ideological combatants on the right, and we can't help ourselves but pull back from macroeconomics and the world situation to talk about our own internal fights about matters that we've been fighting about for decades. Matt, I got into a little tussle online last night with a tariff fan and a Trump economic fan, getting into the old question of whether or not the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1931, is that right?
I think 1930.
1930?
And then they came in effect in 1931.
Right. Okay. So the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. So the Smoot-Hawley tariffs were the theory of everything at the beginning of the Depression, or when people were trying to analyze the Depression over time. That this create this worldwide trade war that deepened and solidified the Depression for a decade, and then came the revisionist ideas, largely sponsored by Milton Friedman, that Smoot-Hawley was important, but it wasn't that important. That it was monetary policy and the tightening of monetary policy that led to this worldwide calamity, which has now somehow been translated on the right into Smoot-Hawley was fine. Don't be dissing Smoot-Hawley. It didn't do it. So if this is like Smoot-Hawley, bring it on. Sure. Now, that is not what Milton Friedman was saying at Smoot-Hawley. He didn't deny that a worldwide trade war had calamitous, knockoff consequences. It was that wasn't the motivating driver of the Depression, and that the policies that were being pursued in monetary terms hadn't been the primary factor. But it's not like they weren't a factor, or that they were good. And somehow some of our people seem to are trying to shoehorn Milton Friedmanism into an argument for what Trump just did yesterday.
Mm-hmm. Well, first, John, it's so unlike you to get in a tussle on Twitter that I can only imagine how impassioned you are about Liberation Day, that you would get into a fight with somebody on Twitter. Second, I'm sorry that I dropped out of the conversation. Clearly, there was some type of retaliatory tariff imposed on my Wi-Fi connection here at the American Enterprise. Yes, the trade war that AEI and Brookings has been engaged in, our next door neighbor, for decades, has finally come home to roost here, and I lost my internet there briefly. So having missed much of the conversation, I want to say a couple things. The first is, we're now in the 10th year of people trying to retrofit intellectual explanations for what is essentially Donald Trump's personal worldview. And this policy that came about yesterday is the ultimate expression of how Trump has felt about the global economy, basically since he's been a public figure. I always
some people say since he was a teenager.
Yeah,
Some friend of his from high school said his whole view then was, why are we letting the world screw us? Like that's what he said at military
That
school.
is his psychology, right? Winners and losers. You're either making money from somebody or they're ripping you off. The moment that this came home to me yesterday was when he's going through his big chart of all the tariffs, and he settles on Cambodia. And he says, look at Cambodia. Cambodia has been making a lot of money off of us. Sorry, Cambodia. Now, I'm 43 years old. I have never spent any mental energy on the U.S.-Cambodia economic relationship. A small country that is
a far-off country,
of which I know nothing, that is completely irrelevant to the American economy. And yet in Donald Trump's head, they've been cheating us with their tariffs. They're making money of our tariffs, and therefore we need to impose tariffs on Cambodia. I have no idea what we import from Cambodia. So, but that's how he thinks. And as David observed very astutely at the top of the podcast, we're just fine with the president having this power now. You know, there are 14 American trade agreements. The number of countries we have free trade agreements is higher because some of them, like CAFTA, the Central America Free Trade Agreement, covers a number of countries. He's just ignored them. We're just putting on these two tariffs that violate the terms of free trade agreements that Congress approved and past presidents have negotiated. So the role of the executive here is also extremely striking. The executive, in the service of a personal vision that he feels now empowered to impose on the rest of the world. And the final thing is, I was struck during the event when Trump, is such a showman, and one of his techniques is bringing people from the audience. Trump is unusual, actually, among political figures, because he will take a step back on the stage and allow other people to speak. Again, it's that type of producer talk show mentality he has. And he brought on a UAW worker who, very impassioned, talked about how his whole career he's seen plants leave Michigan. And I just want to point out that the Michigan's economy is not something we should emulate as a society. People have been leaving Michigan because of taxation, because of bad spending policies, because of overregulation, because of labor contracts that harm competitiveness.
All of which, what you're trying to say is that Michigan has been attempting to use government policy to deal with the deindustrialization problem for 50 years with a net effect that has been negative.
Correct.
To that very person that Trump was saying, I'm going to save you now with more government intervention.
That's right. The way to look at where the auto industry in the United States has gone. It's gone to red America, Tennessee. Just like voters have gone to South Carolina, to Tennessee, places like Texas, right? That's the policy we should be emulating. And those policies, they're not imposing tariffs on other states. As I said the other day, they can't do that, but that's not how they approach it. They get rid of taxes. They have very few regulations on any sector, and they empower workers to leave and join enterprises that they see fit, not be imprisoned by that labor contracts that may benefit a few, but have much larger costs on the economy. So I feel like we're in for a great relearning of economic lessons that is, maybe we're responsible for it because we haven't been able to teach the benefits of free enterprise, even though we see in real time people moving with their feet to the parts of the country that embrace free enterprise.
David, are you okay on time?
Yeah, about 5 more minutes, John.
Okay, so I think Matt brings up a central salient point, which is that the United States is the equivalent of is a continent, or almost an entire continent, and it has the economy of a continent within within a confederation, and that the key rule in this confederation is that all laws apply equally to all federal laws apply equally to all people.
A union,
and
John.
that these what?
It's a union.
It's a union. Excuse me. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said confederation.
Just
Union of American.
a lot rides on that distinction in our history.
American capitalist republics, but that laws, full faith and credit of the country applies to everybody equally, and that states can't punish other states and do all that. Right? That's one of the things that is so extraordinary about the American experiment. And so you don't have to be educated in free enterprise. All you need to know is you have your friend Harry who says, I just moved to Texas. I'm paying 15% less in taxes, and there are a lot more jobs available. And I feel a little freer because I can go from working here to working there. And, maybe you should come down and come move here, which is effectively all of that rolled into an individual experience without sort of lesson in macroeconomics. Then we start having conversations at a more elevated level. And David, you had mentioned, it's important that goods be less expensive for people. They'll still buy things on credit, but you're still talking about the well-being of people in the United States. And yeah, it matters that things are cheaper in some places and more expensive in other places. And people have to make a decision. Sometimes it's a family decision. Sometimes it's an emotional decision. Sometimes they're locked in place because of a mortgage, whatever. They have to make a decision to stay in one place or move to another. And in the global economy, you're talking about a very flat set of circumstances. You have a country, you have the United States, you have a country, and we say, boom, 20% tariff on you. They don't have any they got nowhere to turn. I mean, maybe they can turn to China. I mean, maybe they can get a different customer. Maybe. I mean, China's a pretty big economy. India's a pretty big economy. We're tariffing them like crazy also. But I mean, you are creating the conditions under which the planet is going to be frozen into place, simply coping with this mad king's proclivities. You're without recourse, except a trade war.
And we can focus on all the negative things that does, all the bad parts, but we also have to remember that there's a bunch of good things that then aren't happening. And that's a slightly different articulation.
Yeah.
That free trade is not just simply the avoidance of something bad. It is free exchange of goods and services is by definition wealth creating. You are undermining wealth creation and general productive activities with impediments to trade. I now believe that there was a bigger error than I realized in not insisting on winning the argument in 2015-16 when much of this started to be said. People that were then talking about, we're going to bring all these jobs back to Ohio because China's been ripping us off. And folks on my side of this were continually saying, here's the problem with the way you want to go about doing it. But we weren't really making the case persuasively to the American people as to why these countries were not ripping us off by selling us things. And in fact, the issues primarily in labor data over the last 40 years deal with greater efficiencies in American manufacturing. There's no question that certain jobs were replaced as a result of trade deals, but that it was so marginally minuscule in the grand scheme of things relative to the larger issue that we can make more things in America now with less labor output, leveraging technology. And the general thing, even the Wall Street Journal sort of walked away from the Ricardan argument about comparative advantage over time. It became a political loser because we decided it was a political loser. And so I fear that right now, Milton Friedman has become what Goldman Sachs became in my business a while back, where supposedly you're making an argument just by saying the word. like, oh, Goldman Sachs was just supposed to be this sort of symbol of evil because Matt Taibbi said it was. And now the people on the right are saying Milton Friedman as if we're just supposed to know that, like, he clearly, was wrong or undermined or overstated the argument for benefits of free exchange. He didn't overstate the arguments of free exchange. And on the margin, there are all kinds of things we can do to have better trade deals. But the general focus for all people, working class people who work at Goldman Sachs and lower income people looking for more mobility in society, the general thing we ought to be doing is pursuing greater gross trade, higher imports, higher exports. But when the president says that they're ripping us off from trade deficit and that we don't sell people things anymore, and when we are selling 4 times as many things to the rest of the world as we were in the early 90s, when we first entered this big bad, when China came into WTO, NAFTA.
Globalization.
What's that? Globalization.
Yeah, globalization.
Yeah,
globalization has been a force multiplier for the United States, not a net destroyer.
But we essentially have an issue that we didn't make clear to the American people in the presentation of our argument, that all that happened is exports went up 4x in this period of great additional prosperity, but imports went up a little bit more than 4x. And we're supposed to think that's a bad thing. It's such a ridiculous argument, but it's now just sort of the politically mainstream case being made. And I don't mind so much when President Trump says that, like Matt's point about the Cambodia thing is so true. You could just cut and paste it and run it on Saturday Night Live. It was hilarious if it wasn't real.
Right.
But when Claremont is saying it, I don't know what world I'm in now. That's why Thomas Sowell last night just gave me a little bit of sanity.
Yeah, Thomas Sowell, we should say. Thomas Sowell, an economist, maybe the most venerable living American economist, has an interview you can see on YouTube with Peter Robinson on Common Knowledge, explaining his view of the tariff. Sowell is 94 years old. We should all hope that we could be as unbelievably lucid and clarifying as he is at 74, let alone at 94. And everybody should look this up and watch it, because it is the perfect counterpoint to what Trump was saying yesterday afternoon.
Lucid and clarifying and principled.
And principled, right.
And that's the issue here that I'm talking about. And I know you guys do it every day, and there's still a group of us out there. But these are basic first principles that the constitutional side, that vote, you notice people can't pile on Mitch McConnell and Susan Collins for voting with the Democrats to not allow the president imperial authority to use pretextual falsities to impose tariffs on Canada, because Rand Paul voted with them.
That happened yesterday. We should say there was a vote in the Senate, 48-51, 3 Republicans voting with the Democrats against Canada tariffs.
I think it was 4, because I think Lisa and Susan both voted, along with McConnell and then Rand Paul.
Okay, so it was 4. I'm sorry. Anyway, it was so, yeah. So, I mean, what is notable here, of course, is that the Mr. Republican, the man who would do anything to empower Republicans, as, for whatever reason, for 10 years, the great demon for the Democratic Party, Mitch McConnell, the man who prevented Merrick Garland from getting a vote for the Supreme Court, is now basically become the great dissenter and voted against the Trump administration on these grounds, on grounds of maintaining the constitutional order under which this is the power of the Congress and not the president to levy such things, and not use nonsense claims of national emergency or national security to impose these imposts on friendly nations with whom we are not only not at war, but are it's massively intertwined.
well,
on the same day as the great beautiful announcement.
but I think that if there were some who decided that our free market or laissez-faire or classical economic principles, they don't really demonize David Ricardo the way they do Milton Friedman, because Ricardo is not a household name. But putting aside the economic case here that I refuse to put aside, just on the constitutional basis alone, the imperialism of this, and this idea that if you thought the policy was right, and therefore it's okay to use national security as a basis. There is no difference in that and what Biden did with student loan forgiveness. He took a policy that we think was wrong, that he thought was right, and just did it in a way that's totally unconstitutional and illegal. And we did not just criticize the end, we criticized the means, because the means were wrong. And this is calling this stuff a national security issue means, just like the Nippon Steel, U.S. Steel blockage, pretending you're doing it for national security basis just means nothing is really a national security issue. I don't think that bodes very well for the geopolitical interest of the United States. No credibility.
It reminds me of that moment in the great movie The Departed, the Martin Scorsese movie with Leonardo DiCaprio and Matt Damon, when the FBI is trying to figure out what cop is giving evidence to, or is like in the pay of the mob. And Alec Baldwin is the head of the FBI squad, and somebody pulls something out to say they can, they have some means of doing a warrantless wiretap on, I guess, Matt Damon's phone or something like that. And Baldwin in William Monahan's screenplay says, "Yes, thank God, Patriot Act. Let's go, Patriot Act." I mean, it's the sort of the same thing, right? Which is, National Security Act of 1952. You know what? Did you pick your feet in Poughkeepsie? That's a national security. I mean, this is a very deeply important moment. And yeah, we've been talking about it for a decade, and the rubber is meeting the road. And of course, everybody always is delighted to drop their argument about the means by which they're getting the end they want, if they're getting the end they want. Intellectual inconsistency, it turns out, is, even in an intellectual movement, not something that is all that important to people when they can get the policy enacted that they want, which is very distressing and has been the lesson of the right now for a decade in dealing with Trump, and something that we've been coping with. But we're going here again, like crossing a
and I mean, to your point at the top of the show, John, we're going to have to see what happens here, because we are in uncharted waters. This is the biggest shock to the global economy in decades. I mean, it was certainly comparable to the
at least since COVID, at least since
COVID, right?
So that's 5 years ago was the COVID shutdown. That was a huge shock.
And then the global financial crisis was 2008,
and then 9/11.
9/11, 2001, and then you kind of go back to the Nixon shock, which I think is comparable to this in 71. So I think from the point of view of Trump and his supporters, they're viewing this as the Battle of Austerlitz, with Napoleon triumphing and beginning his surge across Europe.
How did that end?
Well, it ended in the Battle of Waterloo about 11 years later, and
the Battle of Borodino,
that was the beginning. Yeah, and that first, exactly. Well, we don't have to get into the niceties of the Napoleonic campaigns, but nonetheless, the question is this Austerlitz or is it Waterloo? Yeah. And we really don't know, but it doesn't. It doesn't look good, but we can make some predictions based on the economic principles that we've been discussing that say that this could be a very bad mistake.
I want to politically say, that the I told you so never Trumpers, again, not to go to a different camp of ideological friends now, combatants, whatever, are doing the, "Oh yeah, this is what you wanted, you people who say it's okay that Trump won. I mean, yeah, this is what you wanted." But it's like, this is the problem with our system. And this is, again, I want to get to like why I hate liberals. So I don't hate liberals, but why I hate liberal policy, because in the end, all elections like this come down to two people, and you have two people and you have to pick between one or the other of them. And Trump always said he wanted to do tariffs. He always said he wanted to do tariffs, but he said he wanted to do a lot of other things. And Biden and Harris and Clinton never said they wanted to do tariffs, but they always said they wanted to do a whole bunch of other things. And a whole bunch of other things were bad. And one of the things that was bad, getting to David's point, is that rather than talk about the glories of the US economy and trade and the benefits of trade and capitalism and how capitalism functions, they were always on the attack. We're polluting too much. We need to impose international controls to save us from global warming. And mostly when we talked about international relationships, we talked about them in terms of extending our friendships so that people wouldn't be mad at the United States for its depredations, rather than talking about how we were a world leader in opening the planet.
Yeah, well, I mean, just to make the contrast a little bit more pointed, I mean, what was one of Biden's major goals in his term was a global minimum corporate tax, right? And so that would have been revived under a Harris presidency. And what's the other major goal of the left that continues to this day? That is a concerted global effort to reduce carbon emissions by any means necessary, whether that is through regulation, whether that's through decarbonizing economies. And what does that produce? Well, that produces the divergence between the American economy, which resisted, thanks to political efforts, the Biden ideology for much of those 4 years, and Europe, and in particular Germany, which has gone net zero and is now an economic basket case. So we always should be comparing. And to quote the great Thomas Sowell once again in this podcast, I think it was from him that I learned that the most important words in life are compared to what? But there's no question that compared to the Harris policies, this trade policy is potentially just as bad as some of the Harris policies that are also bad.
I think that is a very, very important thing to make note of, because I don't want to turn here and say, I'm sorry that people voted for Trump. It's not that simple. And the fact is that we have a bipartisan problem with understanding the glories, strengths, purposes, and philosophical basis that has made the United States the richest and freest and most important country the world has ever seen.
I also think, by the way, just for what it's worth, David mentioned the off ramps of a win, of Trump being able to claim a win. My prediction is he takes off ramps sooner than later. As things
you're
tumble.
You're very good at predicting, and I agree with you. I mean, I hope so.
Yeah, me too.
But I do think
not on Cambodia though.
Yeah,
He's got his eye fixed on Cambodia. They've been making too much money off the United States.
But that just doesn't resolve the uncertainty. But that just doesn't resolve the uncertainty issue, right, David? I mean, even if he takes the off ramp,
right?
No.
He got on the on ramp, and unless he blows up the on ramp, there's always an on ramp in somebody's head about what they're going to do with how much money they're going to spend building another net exporting dock in the Gulf of Mexico or the Gulf of America or whatever the hell you want to call it, in order to get fracked oil out of the United States. That's a $6-10 billion investment. Someone's going to say, I don't know what's going to happen here. I better just hold up until 2029 when I get a better sense of what the economic conditions in the United States are.
It's a structural risk premia, and the parallel is the left-wing policies on oil and gas, that sometimes there's a 10 or 20-year process. You look at like nuclear energy, the ROI, the return on that investment is so long-term. And when the left has said, we're here to structurally destroy your business, even various ebbs and flows in policy that are favorable have contained investment in energy infrastructure in the United States because of the long-term policy threat that the left has put into the risk premia of the space. And I think that that's an analogy to what has happened here. Is President Trump can announce tomorrow that he had a great meeting with the president of Cambodia, and he really feels like we're about to open up trade with this country that's been destroying jobs in Ohio. And you're going to have businesses that say, but what's he going to say next week or 2 weeks?
Yeah.
And that element, it only takes a quarter of a point or half of a point in GDP to tip us into recession. I don't think you could possibly right now assume that you're not going to get a full percentage impact to GDP in the next 2 quarters because of this.
Look, what was Trump's main economic phrase during 2024, right? It was drill, baby, drill. Our future is going to come from energy exploration, net export. This is where we have gold in the ground. We pull it out. We drill for it. We ship it out. We sell it here. Everything's great. Then he turns around and makes it twice as expensive to build a drill bit. Right? I mean, that's basically what happened with these tariffs. So you want to drill, but you make drilling twice as expensive, you're going to get less drilling. Like, that's just, so he's punching himself in the face in terms of, not punching America in the face also, but even by his own logic. What he has done is interfering with the thing that he needs in order to have a successful presidency in terms of economic growth. The one thing that the crazy guy that not the crazy, but the guy the tariff guy that I got into a fight with last night on Twitter did say is, what he should have done was pair this. If they're going to claim that they're going to get $400 billion in revenue from the tariffs, they should immediately announce a $400 billion tax cut so that the tariffs immediately, so the American people believe that the money that comes in from the tariffs are going to go right to them. Now, this is nonsense. It's obviously economic nonsense. You can't do something like that. That money doesn't come into government coffers and then go out, another way. But you can at least see the logic in saying we're going to try to figure out some way in which this is going to benefit you, the American consumer. That isn't in 20 years we're going to have a functioning industrial economy for your grandchildren.
But John, he did. He announced that one tax policy he announced yesterday to appease us supply-siders in the midst of announcing the largest tax increase on the American people since 1968 was that he'd make auto loan interest tax deductible if you buy a fully American-made car. It was like insult to injury for a supply-sider after all of the tariff announcements. Yeah. To go to the least broad-based, most selective, most distortive, most easily priced in type of tax policy. Very like when Kamala Harris announced they wanted to give money to people to buy for a down payment on a house, and a bunch of us said, I think that might get priced in to the cost of the house, as if the deduction of auto interest would not push car prices higher. I think I'm living in a twilight zone right now. Even the tax cut policy had to offend me yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, that's an important point, because what's striking about the Trump tax cut round 2 is its emphasis on basically tax carve-outs to feed consumption. So, no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security, now depreciation, or now, deductible auto loans. Those aren't tax.
The only thing I'll say is that behind the scenes, the people on the good shoulder of Trump from 1.0 are still saying, when I'm talking with Larry and Art and Steve Moore, Steve Forbes, they still believe that he will end up getting in the tax bill. Either a reduced corporate rate, bonus depreciation, 100% business expensing, things that would be very supply side.
That's right.
And you're right. All the public side is very demand.
The political side is on tax carve-outs that will help or are meant to help consumers, but do not actually affect incentives to work, save, and produce.
Gentlemen, global financial markets need me. I have to go.
Okay, please, David. Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
thank you.
Fantastic to have you, David. Don't wait till it says you've
Yep.
uploaded after you close. Before
Yeah,
you
you
go,
can leave, but then just
you
wait
can
just
leave, but you have to let it say
It'll
you've
be a-
successfully uploaded.
a few seconds.
So hit
So
the
if you
leave button.
click the
Yeah.
leave button,
Yeah,
and then you okay.
yeah, and then follow from there.
Okay.
Can
Well,
I
that
make,
was fun, wasn't it?
it was fun. Can I make my recommendation?
Please, we need a
Okay.
recommendation.
All right. Now, because we're on video, I'm going to leave for a second to get the recommendation.
This is good. This is 2 days in a row in which someone has actually
Yeah.
left.
But I'm not
and
going to
come
wear
back
it. I'm not going to wear it like
Okay.
you did. This
Okay.
is my recommendation. The Way the World Works by Jude Wanniski, one of the first theoreticians of supply-side economics. This is the 20th anniversary edition I have in my hands. You can still buy it on Amazon. It has multiple postscripts, multiple introductions. It has also an introduction by the great Robert D. Novak, who famously said that the Republican Party was put on earth to lower taxes, to cut taxes. Just briefly, June Wanniski was a Wall Street Journal writer who in the 1970s, responding to stagflation, started hanging out with Robert Mundell, a future Nobel laureate, then teaching at Columbia University, and also a Chicago Business School professor named Art Laffer. And the three of them convinced the editor of the Wall Street Journal opinion pages at the time, the great Robert Bartley, that the way to get out of stagflation was to have solid money, stable prices, but then cut taxes, have free trade, reduce spending, and reduce transfers. And if you had that policy mix, as they call it, and as Wanniski describes it in The Way the World Works, prosperity would result. And that was the genesis of the Reagan tax cut and Reagan economic policy that was the dominant economic policy paradigm on the American right up until 2016. So I urge everyone, especially the young people, get your copy of The Way the World Works. Now, I'm going to warn people, there are parts of the book that are a little crazy. You know, Jude was a little crazy, but he was crazy in defense of freedom. And that's the type of crazy I like.
I got two things to say about that book. Number one, piety, filial piety requires me to say that my mother was the publisher of The Way the World Works by Jude Wanniski, one of the two major economic texts that she helped bring to the market, the other being Wealth and Poverty by George Gilder. So that's number one. My late mother, Midget Ector, important figure on the right, and little known as an important figure as one of the people who brought these ideas to a general audience between hardcovers in a relatively brief career as a book editor. That's number one. Number two, Jude was a crazy person, and by the time he hit the 1990s, was desperately trying to enlist Louis Farrakhan in the
he ended up with a soft spot for Saddam.
Yeah,
and,
he was bonkers, but you know, crazy people often.
If you're crazy for freedom,
yeah. Yes.
Also, finally, just can Javier Milei call up President Trump and just explain this? You know, this policy you should reconsider, Donald, because look at what I'm doing in Argentina. I'm following the classic conservative economic principles. Poverty is down, growth is up, the inflation is stabilized. Look at what works.
Okay, wait, I got to check on what the tariff is on Argentina.
Yeah, I know, right?
I don't know what it is. It's at least 10%. That's all I got to tell you.
They've been
at least 10%.
taking our steaks, those and the wine, Argentine wine, stealing California vineyards jobs.
Yeah, I'm going to finish just by saying that we are bombing the crap out of the Houthis. So at least something good is happening
compared
on the planet.
Compared to
what? That's right. It's compared to what? So, again, thanks to David Bahnsen, and for Matt and Abe, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.